Well, hello, everybody. It's great to see you again. And hello, Bernie. You're back again, aren't you? And we finished the Lord's Prayer, haven't we? And we're going to do something different today, aren't we? I'll tell you about that in a minute. But how are you feeling, first of all? I'm feeling good, says Bernie. That's good to know. But I'm also feeling a bit confused, he says. Well, why are you feeling confused, Bernie? He says he's confused because I've turned my table round for this recording. Well, I'll tell you what, Bernie, I'll tell you why I've done that. It's to do with reading the Bible, which we're going to be thinking about today. But I'll tell you about that in a minute. But I'm just wondering, do you ever read the Bible, Bernie? Sometimes, he says. And what do you make of it, Bernie? It's a bit boring, he said. So tell me, Bernie, why do you find reading the Bible boring? Yes, I understand, Bernie. He said he started and he got into the book of Leviticus, and it was all about the funny laws that the Israelites had. And those are really hard to understand and really boring. Well, do you know what, Bernie? I quite agree with you. A lot of the Bible, it's very hard to understand. It can be a bit boring to read, but that's the first thing I want to tell you about today, about understanding how to read the Bible. And it's why I've turned my bookshelves round. Can you see? That's right. There's lots of different books, isn't there, in my bookshelves? And that's the first thing I want you to understand about the Bible, Bernie. This book, the Bible, isn't just one book. Do you know what? It's actually a library of books, Bernie. It's actually 66 books written by 40 authors over a period of thousands of years. That can't be right, he said. How can you get 66 books inside one book cover? Well, I'll tell you what, Bernie, it's a bit like a filing cabinet, maybe. There's lots of different compartments, and you just put different books all together, but it's only one drawer, really, isn't it? And really, that's what we think of the Bible. It isn't just one book, it's actually a whole library of books, rather like this bookshelf behind me where I've got all my books together. And there's lots of different sorts of books in the Bible. The first thing to tell you about those books, Bernie, is that they're divided into two parts. It's almost like there's two shelves in a filing cabinet. And the first part is called the Old Testament. And the second part is called the New Testament. Now, the first Old Testament is really BC. Do you know what BC stands for, Bernie? I wonder, children, do you know what BC stands for? Can you shout it out so that Bernie can hear? Let's get his ear up. What does BC stand for? I think he heard you. Before Christ. And that's the Old Testament books. There's about 39 of them, and they describe what life was like before Jesus came to earth. And then the New Testament starts off AD. And do you know what AD stands for, Bernie? Shall I tell you? It stands for Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. So that's easy to understand, isn't it? So what sort of books are there in the Bible? Well, I'll show you the sort of books I've got in my bookshelf, and because some of them actually a bit like the books we have in the Bible, Bernie. First of all, we've got history books. This is a history of Ireland, a book I've got. There's 17 history books, the first books in the Bible. And again, yes, they've got some laws in them, but most of them are quite exciting stories about what happened in Israel's history. So that's the first 17 of those books. But then we've got 5 books which are called wisdom books. And again, this is a book I've got called The Wisdom House. And those books give you really good advice on how to live. And that includes the book of Psalms, which I suppose was a bit like Israel's hymn book at the time. But there's lots of good advice in those 5 books about how to live. And then after that, we've got what are called prophecy books. And these books tell a bit about the future. And they're usually the prophets actually calling Israel back to God. Because you see, in their history, Bernie, a lot of the Israelites went away from God and they started disobeying him. So the prophets told them what would happen if they didn't obey God. And they were, in a sense, looking into the future. So those 3 sort of books make up the Old Testament, Bernie. But then we're in the New Testament, and the first 4 are quite easy. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are all stories about Jesus. They tell the story of Jesus's life, mainly actually just the last 3 years of his life. But they're the books we probably know the best. And then after that, there's a book which isn't even a book. It's actually, they're more like this. They're more like letters. This is a letter I got through the post this week. And they're written by people like Paul and John and Peter. And there's some advice, Bernie, to the early churches on how to the best way to live. So a lot of those are fairly long, but others are very short. Some of them are just 1 chapter long even. And then the final book is a book on its own. It's called Revelation. And it's really about Jesus coming back, the second coming of Jesus. And again, it's quite hard to understand that book, but it tells us what's going to happen at the end of the world. So it really is just a bit like a library, like I said. And the thing about a library is it doesn't mean, Bernie, that you have to start at the beginning. Was that where I went wrong, he said? Well, possibly. I mean, Genesis is quite an interesting book. But maybe the best place to start is the New Testament because it's a bit more modern. And maybe, Bernie, the best place to start is either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John, one of those 4 Gospels. And if you start there, you'll probably find it a lot easier to read. But I quite like to read the Old Testament, said Bernie. And yes, there's some great stuff there. If you're going to read the Old Testament, why not start at Genesis? Because again, there's lots of interesting stories there. Or maybe the Psalms, Bernie, because they've got some fantastic poetry and again, some really good advice on how to serve God. But maybe the way to treat the Bible is to see it like a library, just a bit like all these books behind me. And that means we can start reading it anywhere. We haven't just got to start at the beginning. That's very good advice, Bernie. He said, shall we try and read a little bit of the Bible every day this week? That's a brilliant bit of advice, Bernie. Why not start in one of the Gospels? And let's just try and read a bit of the Bible every day. And then maybe we can talk about it, can't we, with each other, what we've learned from it. Should we do that? So hopefully, Bernie, that's made it a little bit more easy to understand what the Bible's like. We'll come back again next week. And again, I'll tell you a couple of other symbols that maybe help us to understand the Bible a bit better. But shall we finish with a prayer now? Let's say a prayer together, shall we? That's right. Dear God, we do thank you for your wonderful book, the Bible. Sometimes it is hard to understand, but please help us as we read it to hear your voice speaking to us and giving us good advice. So thanks again, Bernie, for being here. Shall we come back next week and see the children? I think he's quite excited about that. So I hope you've had a good day today. The rest of the day goes well. Bernie and me will see you next Friday for another exciting instalment on how to read the Bible. Bye-bye then.